The gun was already cocked when Letitia Dawson pressed it against Samuel Lockhart's chest. Her hand did not shake. That was the most terrifying part. 3 years of widowhood, 3 years of holding this farm together with cracked knuckles and sheer refusal, and her hand had learned to be as steady as ironwood. The late afternoon sun poured through the open doorway behind him, turning him into a silhouette, broad-shouldered and unhurried, as if a woman pointing a Colt Navy revolver at his heart was simply part of his Tuesday. "I told you to leave," she said. Her voice was the temperature of creek water in January. "You did," Samuel Lockhart agreed. He did not raise his hands. He did not step back. He simply looked at her, calm as a man who had already decided what he was willing to lose. "You told me to leave yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that one. And yet here you stand on my porch. Here I stand." The silence between them was not empty. It was packed tight with everything she had refused to say and everything he had refused to stop believing. The hammer of the revolver caught the light. His eyes never left hers. "This is a betrayal," she said, and her voice cracked on that single word in a way it had not cracked on anything in 3 years. "Of everything I built here, everything I protected. You come riding in with your money and your promises, and you think you can simply dismantle what it cost me everything to construct. I don't want to dismantle anything, Letitia." The sound of her name in his mouth did something violent to her composure. "Do not call me that. It's your name." "It is what my husband called me," she said, and there it was, the dark past laid between them like a body on the floor. "And my husband is dead. And the last man who stood in this doorway with bright eyes and good intentions is buried on the hill behind that barn, and I put him there, Mr. Lockhart. Not with a gun, with the simple act of loving him in a territory that does not forgive softness. I will not do it again." The gun pressed harder. He still did not move. "Then shoot me," Samuel Lockhart said quietly, "or lower that gun and let me tell you why I came back." It was 1878, and the Dawson homestead sat 14 miles east of Abilene, Kansas, on a stretch of land that the wind had been trying to reclaim since the day it was first broken. The soil was good. The fences were sound. The barn was painted a red, so faded it had become the color of an old argument. Letitia had built all of it after her husband Thomas Dawson had died of a fever in the autumn of 1875, leaving her with 40 acres, 1 milk cow, a 6-year-old boy named Eli, and a debt to the First National Bank of Abilene that sat on her chest every morning when she woke. She had not asked for help. The asking of help had always seemed to her a door that, once opened, could not be shut again, and Letitia Dawson had made a religion out of keeping her doors shut. She had managed the cattle herself. Hiring seasonal hands, she paid exactly what she owed them and not a cent more. She had learned to run a plow line as straight as a man twice her size. She had learned to negotiate at market with a directness that made buyers blink and then respect her. She had learned to read land contracts with the attention of a lawyer and to draft letters with the precision of someone who understood that a misplaced comma was the same as a loaded weapon in the wrong hands. She had paid off the debt in 2 years. She had bought 30 more head the 3rd year. She had expanded the pasture, repaired the well, put glass in the windows instead of oiled paper. What she had not done was let anyone close enough to see that the woman who ran all of this was also the woman who sometimes sat on the back porch steps in the dark after Eli was asleep and pressed her forehead against her knees and allowed herself, for exactly 10 minutes and no longer, to feel how profoundly alone she was. Samuel Lockhart had first appeared in her life in April of 1878, and he had appeared in the most inconvenient way possible, which was to say, useful. He was a cattleman out of Wichita with a reputation that preceded him like weather. 34 years old, never married, owner of the Lockhart Ranch, which ran close to 2,000 head across 3 counties. He was not a man of idle habits or empty words. The ranchers in the area spoke of him with the particular respect that men reserve for other men who have earned what they own. He had arrived in Abilene to negotiate a trail drive north to the railhead at Ellsworth, and somewhere in the course of those negotiations, someone had mentioned the Dawson widow and her quality of cattle, and he had ridden out to have a look. He had knocked on her door at 10:30 on a Tuesday morning in April, when the prairie grass was beginning its first green reaching toward the sky, and Letitia had opened the door with flour on her hands and answered every single one of his business questions with the flat efficiency of someone who had no time for anything that was not business. He had bought 12 of her cattle that day at a fair price. He had left. She had thought that was the end of it. He had come back the following Tuesday. Not for cattle. He had appeared at her door with a piece of paper in his hand, a surveying document that her neighbor Hector Braun had apparently been circulating, quietly gathering signatures, attempting to reroute the water rights to the eastern creek away from the smaller holdings and toward the larger ones. Her 40 acres were on the edge of that rerouting. She would have lost creek access for half her pasture. "How did you get this?" she had asked, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. "Braun's foreman showed it to me thinking I'd sign it," Samuel said. "I didn't." "Why not?" He had looked at her with those unhurried eyes of his. "Because it isn't right." She had stared at him for a long moment. "And what do you want for this?" "Nothing. Men do not ride 14 miles for nothing." "This man apparently does," he had said, and then he had touched the brim of his hat and walked back to his horse and left. She had thought about that for a long time afterward, longer than was comfortable, and the thinking about it was its own kind of warning to herself. He had come back the following Tuesday. She had begun to close the door before he finished tying his horse. He had knocked anyway. She had stood on the other side of it with her back against the wood and her eyes on the ceiling, listening to him knock 3 times with the patience of a man who was not in any particular hurry. "Mrs. Dawson," he had said through the door, "I have information about the water rights filing. There's a county meeting on Thursday, and you need to be there or Braun's petition goes through by default." She had opened the door, because she was not a foolish woman, and she recognized that some traps are disguised as inconveniences, and some inconveniences are disguised as traps, and she needed to know which this was. She had gone to the county meeting. She had spoken, clearly and precisely, and 3 other small holding families had joined her objection, and Braun's petition had been tabled pending a full review. Samuel Lockhart had sat in the back of that meeting room and said nothing. He had not tried to speak for her. He had not positioned himself beside her as though she were his cause. He had simply been present, a witness, and when the meeting ended and she walked out into the evening air with her heart beating fast and her chin high, he had been standing by the hitching post with 2 horses, hers and his, and he had said nothing except, "Good riding." She had not known what to do with a man like that. She had responded by deciding not to find out. The Tuesdays had continued regardless. She had never explicitly invited them, and she had frequently made clear they were not welcome, and he had continued arriving with the steady, undramatic inevitability of sunrise. He had never pushed past a boundary she drew. He had never insisted on entering a space she did not open. He had simply arrived, offered whatever practical thing brought him there, and left when she made it evident she was finished talking. What she had not expected was that the Tuesdays would begin to mean something to her son. Eli was 9 years old in the spring of 1878, dark-haired and serious-eyed in the way of children who have experienced loss early enough that it has become part of their permanent architecture. He did not speak about his father often. He spoke about him in the same way children speak about the weather, as a fact, not a wound. But he had watched the men who moved through their world with the quiet hunger of a boy who understood that something was missing without having the vocabulary to name it. The day he had first spoken to Samuel Lockhart had been the day Samuel arrived on a Tuesday to find Eli standing in the yard with a broken bridle in his hands and an expression of absolute devastation on his face. Letitia had been in the barn and had heard the exchange through the gaps in the wood. "That's a clean break," Samuel had said. "Fixable." "I don't know how," Eli had said. There had been a pause. "You want me to show you?" Another pause. Longer. "Mama says I shouldn't talk to strangers." "That's wise of her. I'm Samuel Lockhart. I buy cattle from your mother. Now we're not strangers." Letitia had pressed her palm flat against the inside of the barn wall and held herself very still. "How do you fix it?" Eli had asked. She had listened to Samuel Lockhart spend 20 minutes showing her son how to mend a bridle with patience and no condescension, and the kind of lateral thinking that came from a lifetime of making things work in places where making things work was the difference between surviving and not. He had not spoken to Eli like a child who needed managing. He had spoken to him like a young man who had asked a reasonable question and deserved a real answer. When she had emerged from the barn with the indifferent expression she wore like armor, Samuel had stood up, hat in hand, and said, "He's a good learner." "He is," she had said. And then, because she could not help it, "Thank you." The gratitude had cost her something. She could feel the cost of it in her chest for the rest of the evening, like a bruise from a fall she had taken by her own choosing. But it was the following Tuesday, the Tuesday of the gun, that had finally broken the surface of everything she had been holding below it. He had arrived that morning as usual. She had been expecting him and had made the decision overnight, the kind of cold, midnight decision that feels like surgery, precise and necessary and grim. She was going to end this, not because he had done anything wrong, because he had done everything right, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. A man who did everything wrong was a threat you could name. You could point to his failures, his selfishness, his darkness. You could say, "Here is the reason, here is the proof, here is the betrayal I knew was coming." A man who did everything right was a trap of a different kind. He was the thing you leaned toward without deciding to, the warmth you moved toward in the cold without noticing your feet were moving, until one day you looked back and you were so far from the safe distance you had promised yourself that you could no longer see the shore. She had been leaning toward Samuel Lockhart for 3 months, and she had not noticed until the night before when she had dreamed about him and woken up with her heart hammering and her hands reaching for something in the dark that was not there. And she had sat up in that pre-dawn silence with the absolute cold clarity of someone who has just understood the nature of their own hidden vulnerability. She could not afford this. She could not afford him. She could not afford the unmaking of herself that love had always been, that it had been with Thomas, who she had loved completely and lost completely, and who had taught her that complete love was also a complete and permanent wound. She had taken the Colt Navy revolver from the chest beside her bed. She had waited on the porch. He had come, as he always did, unhurried and with purpose, and she had met him with the gun and the words and the cold voice, and he had stood there in her doorway and refused to do the thing she needed him to do, which was prove her right by being afraid. "Then shoot me," he had said, "or lower that gun and let me tell you why I came back." The gun came down slowly, not in surrender, but in the exhaustion of someone who has fought too long and knows it. She turned away from him and walked inside, leaving the door open behind her, which was the closest thing to an invitation she had offered in 3 years, and he understood it as such and followed her in and closed the door quietly behind him. The kitchen of the Dawson homestead was a room that told the truth about its owner in ways she would have resented anyone pointing out. It was immaculate and functional, and arranged with a precision that left no space for accident or ambiguity. The curtains were plain white cotton, the table was scrubbed pale, the iron stove was blacked and polished, everything in it was necessary and nothing in it was soft. She set the gun on the table between them and sat down across from it, and he sat down across from her, and neither of them touched it. "Why did you keep coming back?" she asked. Her voice was not the cold January Creek voice now. It was something quieter and more ragged. Samuel Lockhart looked at her across the pale table in the plain kitchen in the middle of the Kansas morning and said, "Because the first time I rode out here, I saw a woman running 40 acres alone and feeding her son and paying her debts and fighting her neighbors, and I thought, this is the most remarkable person I have ever been in the same room with, and I wanted to know her. That's the whole of it. There is no hidden motive, Letitia. There is no scheme. I'm not trying to take your land or make you helpless or make you into something less than what you are. I am simply a man who saw something extraordinary and had the persistent bad judgment to keep coming back." She looked at him for a long time. "You make it sound simple. It isn't simple. You have made it very clearly not simple." A trace of something like wry honesty moved across his face. "I have been turned away from this door more times than I care to count, and each time I ride back to Wichita, I spend the whole ride telling myself that is the last time, that I have some dignity left and I ought to protect it. And yet," he agreed, "I wake up the following Tuesday and there I am." She pressed both palms flat on the table as though steadying herself against something that was trying to tilt the floor. "My husband was good," she said. "He was a good man, not extraordinary, not without fault, but genuinely good. And I loved him in the full, unprotected way you can only love someone when you don't yet understand what loss is. When he died, I understood. And I swore to myself that I would not give anyone the power to do that to me again. It is not about you, Mr. Lockhart. It has never been about you. It is about the fact that caring about someone is the same as handing them a weapon you hope they never use." "I know," Samuel said. "You can't know. I watched my father work himself to death on a ranch that the bank took 6 months after he was gone," Samuel said, and there was something in his voice that had not been there before, a quieter register, where the words cost something. "I watched my mother take that loss and fold herself into it until there was nothing left of who she had been. I was 17 years old and I made myself a promise that I would build something that couldn't be taken, something solid enough that loss couldn't hollow it out." He paused. "I have spent 17 years building. The ranch is solid. The cattle are sound. The land is mine free and clear. And 6 months ago I rode out here on business and I realized that all the building had added up to a very well-constructed kind of a loan." The kitchen held the silence. "I am not asking you to stop being who you are," he said. "I am not asking you to be less guarded or less capable or less yourself. I am asking you to let me be in the room." He looked at her directly. "Just in the room, Letitia, that's all I'm asking today." She sat with that. Outside the window, the prairie wind moved through the grass in long green waves, and the sound of it was the oldest sound in Kansas, the sound of the land breathing, indifferent to every human drama played out on its surface. She had found that indifference comforting once. The land did not need anything from her. It simply was, and she simply was, and between them there was a clean and uncomplicated exchange. Human beings were not like that. Human beings needed and wanted and asked, and the asking was the danger. But he was asking for so little, just in the room. "Eli will be home from school at 4, she said finally. Samuel waited. "If you want to stay for supper," she said, and the words came out as though dragged across gravel, "you can stay for supper." The thing that crossed his face in that moment was not triumph. She had been watching for triumph, for the slight self-congratulatory satisfaction of a man who has gotten what he wanted. What she saw instead was something far more disarming. It was relief. The simple, unguarded relief of a man who has been standing in the cold for a long time and has just been told he may come in. "I'd like that," he said. Eli came home from school at 4 on a horse too big for him, with his lessons under his arm, and his dark hair wind-blown, and his face immediately brightening in a way that Letitia felt like a small arrow in her chest when he saw Samuel's horse tied at the post. "You're here for supper?" he asked, with a 9-year-old's complete inability to disguise hope. "Your mother was kind enough to invite me," Samuel said. Eli looked at his mother with an expression that was carefully neutral but behind which the most enormous happiness was barely contained, and Letitia thought, "You are the most transparent child in Kansas and also the best thing I have ever done, and if you look at me like that one more time I am going to let this man stay in this kitchen forever." She said, "Wash up before you come in," and went inside to start supper. The meal was simple. Salt pork and beans and cornbread, and a jar of the canned tomatoes she had put up in August. She was a competent cook in the same way she was competent at everything, efficiently and without fuss. She put the food on the table and they ate, And the conversation that happened across that table was the most ordinary conversation she had participated in 3 years, and it was extraordinary for its ordinariness. Eli asked Samuel about cattle drives. Samuel described the Kisham Trail in terms a 9-year-old could hold and turned it into a story without being condescending about the turning. Letitia answered questions when asked and asked questions in return and discovered, against her will and with a kind of helpless resignation, that Samuel Lockhart was interesting in the same way the good land was interesting. Not dramatic, not ornamental, rich in a way that rewarded attention. He left at sundown, which was proper. He shook Eli's hand at the door, which was respectful. He looked at Letitia over her son's dark head and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Dawson," with the particular formality of a man who understood that she needed the distance of the title even now, even after everything, and she appreciated it with a sharpness that frightened her. "Next Tuesday, then," she said, and she did not know why she said it, only that the words came out before she had decided to say them. "Next Tuesday," he agreed, and got on his horse and rode into the dark toward Wichita. She stood on the porch until she couldn't hear the hoofbeats any more. The stars over Kansas were extravagant and indifferent, thrown across the sky in the same wild abundance as always, and she stood under them with her arms around herself and thought, "You have made a mistake, Letitia Dawson. You have opened a door," but she did not close it. The Tuesdays changed after that. They were still careful. She was still careful. But there was something different in the texture of them, a shift from the guarded negotiation of two people circling a disputed territory to the tentative conversation of two people who have agreed, without quite saying it aloud, that the territory is shared. He was good with Eli in a way that never felt performed. He did not try to be the boy's father. He did not fill the role with a self-conscious obviousness that would have been its own kind of insult. He simply treated Eli as a person worth his time and attention, and in doing so gave the boy something that Letitia, for all her extraordinary competence, could not give him, which was the experience of being taken seriously by a man. She watched this happening and felt about it the way she felt about most things she could not control, with a vigilant, helpless awareness. There was a Tuesday in June when a summer storm came in fast off the plains, the kind that turned the sky green and sent the cattle running, and had every farmer who knew the land moving at double speed toward safety. Samuel had been there when it hit, helping her repair a section of fence that was more than a two-person job, and they had run the cattle into the lower pasture together, and then run for the barn as the sky opened up. And they had stood inside the barn with the rain hammering on the roof, and the lightning turning the gaps in the wood into brief, brilliant lines, and they had been breathing hard from running and standing very close together in the hay-smelling dark. She had looked at him in one of those lightning flashes and found him already looking at her, and what was on his face in that moment was so unguarded that she felt it like a physical thing, like something pressing against the inside of her sternum from his direction. "Samuel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and they both heard it. "I know," he said. He did not move toward her. He was keeping his word about the room, about only the room, about letting her choose the distance. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "I have forgotten how. Or perhaps I never knew, because when I was young I thought love was simply what happened to you, not something you had to decide. And now I am 29 years old and I understand that deciding is the whole of it, and I am terrified of my own decision." "What are you deciding?" he asked, very quietly, the storm enormous above them. She reached out in the dark and took his hand. It was not dramatic. It was not a kiss or an embrace or any of the ceremonial gestures of romance. It was one hand finding another hand in the dark and holding on. But Samuel Lockhart closed his fingers around hers with a gentleness so careful it was almost formal, and she felt the warmth of his hand travel up her arm and settle somewhere near her heart, and she stood there and allowed it to be there. They stood like that in the barn while the storm burned itself out over Kansas, not speaking, just present, and when the rain finally let go its fury and settled into a gentle, afterthought drizzle, Neither of them moved for a long time. It was Eli, appearing at the barn door with enormous eyes and mud on his boots, who finally broke it. "Mama, are you all right? I was in the root cellar." "I'm all right," she said, and released Samuel's hand and walked toward her son. And the normalcy of the gesture, the simple act of going to her child, was something she needed in that moment, an anchor to the version of herself she understood. "Storm's past," Samuel said from behind her, his voice entirely ordinary. "I'll check the fence before I go." After he had gone, Eli had looked at his mother with those serious, too-old eyes and said, "He's going to come back, isn't he?" "It's a statement, not a question," she observed. "Yes," said Eli. "Yes," said Letitia, "he is going to come back." She did not sleep well that night. She did not sleep poorly either. She lay awake in the specific way of someone who has let something in that she cannot now imagine letting out again. And the sensation was so familiar, so achingly familiar from the early days of loving Thomas, that she turned her face into the pillow and pressed her eyes shut and felt the tears that she had not allowed herself in 3 years finally run down into the linen, silent and unexpected, and when they were over, surprisingly clean. She grieved Thomas Dawson in that dark. Not for the first time, but in a way she had not been able to until now, in the way that you can only grieve a thing fully when you have accepted that it is truly past, and that the living must go on living regardless of what the going costs. She grieved him with love and without guilt, and she said goodbye to him in her own interior way, not to his memory, but to the wall she had built from his absence, the wall she had been living inside for 3 years, calling it safety. Then she wiped her face on the linen and went to sleep. Hector Braun sent a man to her fence line in July. She came out of the house one morning to find 3 sections of her north fence pulled down, and her cattle drifted into the unfenced pasture. She spent 4 hours rounding them up with Eli, who was out of school for the summer and competent on his horse in the way of ranch children who have been in the saddle since before they could walk properly. When she rode to examine the down sections, she found the break was not weather damage or animal pressure. The posts had been pulled from the ground deliberately and the wire cut with pliers. She rode to Braun spread that afternoon alone, because this was not the kind of thing you sent someone else to do for you. Hector Braun was a broad, weathered man of 50-odd years with the particular expression of someone who has been powerful long enough to have forgotten what it felt like to be told no. He received her in his yard with his arms crossed and a patience that was also a kind of contempt. "My north fence," she said, without preamble. "Fences break," Braun said. "Fence posts do not pull themselves from the ground," she said, "and wire does not cut itself. Prove it." "I don't need to prove it to you," she said. "I need to prove it to the county sheriff, which I intend to do this afternoon. And I need you to understand that if I find another section of my fence interfered with, I will pursue this in every legal avenue available to me. And given what I know about the water rights petition you were running earlier this year, I imagine there are people in the county seat who would be very interested in a broader conversation about your practices." Braun looked at her for a long moment, and the contempt shifted, just slightly, into something more cautious. "You are a very hard woman, Mrs. Dawson. I am a woman protecting what is hers," she said. "Goodbye, Mr. Braun." She rode to the sheriff's office and filed a report with Deputy Ellis, a young man who took his notes carefully and promised to look into it. She rode home. She repaired the fence herself with Eli holding the posts while she tamped them in, working until the sun was halfway down the sky, and her arms ached in the particular satisfied way of work that has been completed. Samuel arrived on Tuesday to find her in the yard mending the last section of wire, and she told him what had happened with the flat pragmatism she applied to all facts, and she watched him hold very still in the way he held still when he was making a decision about how much to say. "Braun has been trying to consolidate the smaller holdings around here for 5 years, he said. Your water rights are the last piece he needs to make his eastern pasture viable for a herd big enough to undercut the other ranchers at market." "I know," she said. "He's not going to stop at the fence." "I know that too." "Then let me, Samuel." She looked up from the wire. I have managed this land for 3 years without a man to protect me, and I will continue to manage it. What I need from you is not protection. What I need from you is what you have already given me, which is counsel when I ask for it, and trust that I know what I'm doing." He stood with that for a moment, and she could see the effort it cost him, this man who had spent his life building and protecting and problem-solving, to resist the impulse to solve. But he nodded. "All right," he said. "The fence looks sound." "It is sound," she said. "Do you need a hand with anything else today?" She looked at him over the repaired wire, this man who kept coming back, this man who had held her hand in the dark during a storm and not made it into more than it was, this man who looked at her 9-year-old son like he was worth something, this man with his own dark past and his own well-constructed walls and his patience that was not passivity but something more like respect. "I could use someone to hold the post for the barn gate," she said. "The hinge has been loose for a month." "Show me," he said. In August she kissed him. It was not planned. It happened in the space between one ordinary moment and the next, on the porch in the evening after Eli had gone to bed, when the heat of the Kansas summer was finally releasing its grip on the day, and the air was the temperature of something you might actually want to breathe. They had been sitting on the porch steps, not touching, but close in the comfortable way that had become possible over months of being in the same spaces, talking about nothing important, the quality of the late summer grass, the price at the Ellsworth market, a book she had been reading by lamplight, and he had said something quiet and funny in that understated way he had, and she had laughed, which was itself a rare thing. And she had turned to look at him, and he had been looking at her with that unguarded expression she had started to recognize as his true face, the one under the composure, and she had simply leaned in and kissed him. It was brief and careful and absolutely nothing like she expected it to be, which was to say it was warm and real and present in a way that made the rest of the world fall into its correct proportions around it. When she pulled back, he was very still. "Letitia," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to be clear about what I want," he said, with the directness she had come to understand as one of his primary qualities. "I want to court you properly. I want to come here with intention and have you know the intention. I want to ask you to marry me in the fullness of time, when you are ready, if you ever are. I am not asking you today. I am telling you the direction I am walking in so that you know I am not simply passing through." She looked at the stars over the prairie, the same extravagant stars, the same indifferent sky. "You are the most unexpected thing that has happened to me in my adult life," she said. "I take that as an encouraging statement," Samuel said carefully. She laughed again, and the sound of it surprised her, the way her own happiness could still surprise her like something she had forgotten she was capable of. "Court me then," she said, "properly as you say, and we will see where the direction leads." The courtship that followed was not the courtship of young people with no complications, and it was all the more genuine for it. They moved through it with the deliberateness of two adults who understood what they were choosing and why, who had both built walls and knew the architecture of those walls from the inside, and who were making, together, the very considered decision to dismantle them brick by brick. He brought her books, which she had not expected. Not gift books, decorative and empty, but books he had actually read and thought she would find interesting. A history of the cattle drives, a collection of essays by a woman philosopher, a practical manual on advanced irrigation that had genuinely useful applications for the eastern pasture. She received all of these with the same straight face she gave everything, and read every one of them. And when he came back the following Tuesday, she had opinions about all of them, and they argued pleasantly and at length about the irrigation manual's chapter on soil erosion. And she realized at some point in the middle of this argument that she had not been this engaged in a conversation in years, that she had been existing in a kind of intellectual quiet that she had told herself was peace, and was actually just silence. He brought Eli a proper bridle to replace the mended one, which Eli received with the dignity of someone trying very hard not to appear overwhelmed, and which cost him the effort for approximately 30 seconds before he broke into a grin wide enough to swallow his face. Letitia had looked at Samuel across the yard, with an expression she tried to keep neutral, and that she suspected failed to be neutral at all. The water rights dispute came to its conclusion in September, when the county surveyor completed his review and ruled in favor of maintaining the existing creek access for the smaller holdings, including the Dawson homestead. Hector Braun had hired a lawyer from Kansas City who had made arguments that were technically sophisticated and ethically hollow. Letitia had made her own arguments in writing, with the precision of someone who had been studying land law in her own kitchen for 2 years, and Deputy Ellis had submitted his report about the fence damage, and collectively these things had been enough. She had walked out of the county building into the September afternoon and taken a long breath of the cooling air, and felt the specific relief of a battle that has been won by the right means, not luck or connection or someone else's power, but by the plain work of being prepared and being present and refusing to be intimidated into silence. Samuel had been outside as he had been in that first county meeting, neither invisible nor intrusive. "Well," he said. "We won," she said. He smiled, and she thought it was one of the finest things she had ever seen, simple and real, with no performance in it. "Braun will be difficult for a while," Samuel said. "Braun can be as difficult as he likes," Letitia said. "He doesn't have my creek." There was a moment standing there in the September light when something settled between them like the last piece of a structure clicking into place. She could feel it. She was reasonably sure he could feel it too. "Come to supper," she said. "It's Thursday," he said. "I'm aware of what day it is." He came to supper on a Thursday, and the following Tuesday, and several Thursdays and Sundays after that, and the steady expansion of the days said more than either of them put into direct words. In October, he asked her to marry him. He did it in the kitchen, which was appropriate, at the table where they had first sat across from each other with a gun between them, because Samuel Lockhart understood that the geography of important moments matters and the kitchen was their place, the honest room, the room with no soft things in it that proved she was the most resilient person he had ever met. He did not kneel. She would have found kneeling theatrical and slightly insulting. He sat across from her, and he put both hands on the table, open, the way a man puts down something he is not going to use as a weapon, and he said, "I want to marry you, Letitia. I want to marry you and live on this land with you and help you build this into everything you've been building it toward. I want to be Eli's family in whatever way he'll let me be. I want to stop leaving on Tuesday evenings and start being here in the mornings." He paused. "I know what you're giving up if you say yes. I know the cost of trusting someone again. I know I am asking you to risk something you promised yourself you would never risk again. I do not take that lightly. I will never take it lightly." She looked at him across the pale table in the plain kitchen. "What are you giving up?" she asked. "You never said." He was quiet for a moment. "The version of myself that didn't need anything," he said. "The version that had decided that building alone was enough. I have been very comfortable in that version. It was simple and it required nothing of me that I could not easily provide." He looked at her steadily. "You have made that version of myself impossible to inhabit. I go home on Tuesday evenings and there I am, in my well-built, complete, entirely sufficient life, and it is the emptiest thing in Kansas without you in it." She looked at him for a long time. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." What followed that yes was not the silence of aftermath, but the sound of something beginning, immediate and slightly bewildering, and full of an electricity that she had not allowed herself to feel in years. She became aware of the kitchen as a room she was sharing with a man she had just agreed to love openly and permanently, and the reality of this was both terrifying and, underneath the terror, warm in a way she had no other word for. "There are conditions," she said, because she was Letitia Dawson and conditions were the language of her competence. "I expected there would be," Samuel said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "This is my land. It stays in my name." Whatever we build here, I am equal partner in every decision. I am not an ornament or a helpmate. I am a person with equal standing. I have never wanted anything else, he said simply. Eli's well-being is the first consideration in any decision that affects him. Not the ranch, not the business, not anything else. Eli comes first. Agreed without reservation. She looked at him. And you do not leave when it is hard. I have seen hard. I know how to survive hard. What I cannot survive again is someone who walks away from hard. If you are going to be in this room, you are going to stay in this room. He held her gaze. I rode 14 miles every Tuesday for 6 months to knock on a door you kept closing, he said. I think I have demonstrated something about my intention to stay. She breathed. You have, she said. Yes, you have. They were married in November of 1878, in the small Methodist church in Abilene, in the presence of the minister, Deputy Ellis, who had become something of a friend, 3 of the small-holding families who had joined her water rights fight, and Eli, who stood at Samuel's side with his lesson book tucked under his arm out of habit, and an expression of such complete and careful happiness that 3 of the women in the pews cried without fully understanding why. Letitia wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool she had ordered from the dry goods store in Abilene, because she was a practical woman, and she was not going to pay for imported cloth, and she wore her hair down for the first time in 3 years, which was the only ceremonial gesture she made, and the one that meant the most to the man standing at the front of the church watching her walk toward him. Samuel Lockhart watched Letitia Dawson walk toward him with her chin up and her hands steady and her eyes clear and direct, and the expression on his face was the same expression she had first found so disarming in her kitchen doorway, the one with no performance in it, the simple, unguarded face of a man who is exactly where he chose to be. When the minister asked if anyone had objections, Eli made a sound that was almost certainly not a laugh but was also not quite a cough, and Letitia shot him a look that made him compose himself with visible effort, and Samuel, looking straight ahead at the minister, smiled. They said their vows in the plain words of the ceremony, and they meant every syllable, and when it was done and Samuel kissed her in front of the small assembly, she allowed it to be a real kiss and not a ceremonial one, and the room was warm with it. The first winter of their marriage was the year Letitia learned what it felt like to stop sleeping with one ear open. It was a gradual thing. She did not notice it all at once. She noticed it incrementally, over weeks, in the way that warmth accumulates. She noticed that she was waking in the morning, rather than jerking into alertness at every sound. She noticed that the 10-minute sessions on the back porch steps in the dark had simply stopped happening, not because she had decided to stop them, but because they were no longer necessary, because there was someone else present in the house with her, and the house felt different for it, full rather than hollow, occupied by something other than the sound of her own vigilance. Samuel moved through the Dawson homestead with the same unhurried quality he brought to everything, making himself useful without making himself the center, integrating himself into the rhythms she had established without trying to redirect them. He rose early and worked without direction. He cooked breakfast on Sundays, which turned out to be his one culinary competence, and the biscuits he made were better than hers, a fact she acknowledged exactly once and which he never used as leverage. He was patient with Eli in the long, unglamorous way of someone who understands that children's trust is not given in a single gesture, but in the accumulated weight of 100 ordinary moments. The morning when you remembered what he said yesterday and asked him how it turned out. The afternoon you put down what you were doing to look at the thing he wanted to show you. The evening you sat with him in silence when silence was what he needed. Eli watched Samuel with the specific attention of a child deciding something important, and his decision came on a December evening when, without preamble, he called him Samuel, and then looked at his plate with a carefully neutral expression. And Samuel said, "Pass the salt, please, Eli," in the same voice he always used, and the moment passed into the ordinary fabric of the house. Letitia had been watching from the kitchen doorway, and she had pressed her hand against her own breastbone and breathed through the fullness of it. The spring of 1879 brought two things simultaneously: the first calf of the expanded herd and the information, delivered by Deputy Ellis over coffee at the kitchen table, that Hector Braun had sold his spread and left the county. Sold to who? Letitia asked. A family from Ohio, the Garfields, 3 generations of them. They've already been to introduce themselves to the county clerk. Ellis shook his head. Braun held on as long as he could, but he couldn't make the eastern pasture work without the creek access, and apparently he couldn't get anyone to finance the kind of legal battle it would have taken to change that. So he went. Letitia sat with her coffee and said nothing for a moment. "Good," she said finally. "Simple. Complete." Samuel looked at her across the table with an expression that had a great deal of warmth in it, and she met it directly, which she could do now without bracing herself, which was still occasionally remarkable to her. They went to meet the Garfield family that week, and the Garfields were large and loud and good-hearted in the way of families that have survived difficulty by leaning into each other, and Letitia found herself liking them immediately, and with the slightly startled feeling of someone who had forgotten that liking people on first meeting was something she used to do before the years of necessary wariness. The Garfield grandmother, a woman named Constance who was 70 if she was a day, and had opinions about everything from soil composition to scripture, told Letitia over a kitchen table of her own that she had heard about the water rights fight, and that she thought it was one of the finest things she had encountered since arriving in Kansas. "Most people in a dispute will wait for someone else to act first," Constance Garfield said. "You went to that meeting and you spoke for yourself and for everyone the petition would have hurt. That is not a small thing," Letitia said. "It was the practical thing to do." "Most practical things go undone because they require courage," Constance said, and looked at Samuel over Letitia's shoulder with the direct assessment of a woman who has been reading people for 70 years. "And you, young man, had the sense to marry her." "I had the sense to keep coming back until she let me," Samuel said. Constance laughed, a sound like a door thrown open, and Letitia looked at her coffee and felt the particular warmth she felt more and more frequently now, the warmth of being known and not being afraid of it. That summer, she told him she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen, because they told each other everything that mattered in the kitchen, and she was matter-of-fact about it in the way she was matter-of-fact about everything important, because the matter-of-factness was how she kept herself from being leveled by the size of things. "A baby," he said, and his voice did something she had never quite heard it do. "In the winter, I believe. February, perhaps." He stood up from the table and crossed to her and took both her hands in his, which was the gesture she had come to understand as his version of everything too large to put into words, and he held them for a long moment without speaking. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said, and then, because the kitchen was the honest room and she had agreed to be honest in it, "I am also frightened. Of the birth, of loving something else this much," she said, "of the particular vulnerability of it." He brought her hands up and pressed them briefly against his forehead, which was an unusual gesture for him and absolutely unmistakable in its meaning. "Then we will be frightened together," he said. "You're not frightened," she said. "I am absolutely terrified," he said, and she laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that came from some place below ordinary happiness, the place where the things you thought were gone still lived, changed but present, waiting for the right conditions to come back into the light. Eli received the news with the same studied equanimity he had brought to all major developments over the past year, and then said, with 9-year-old pragmatism, "I hope it is a boy. Boys are less complicated." "You have a complex inner life," Letitia told him. "You may not generalize from your own experience." "All right," said Eli. "I hope it is a boy or a girl, but probably a boy." The winter of 1879 moving into 1880 was cold and clear, the kind of Kansas winter that made the land look like the first day of creation, bare and skeletal and entirely itself. Letitia moved through the later months of her pregnancy with the same practical efficiency she applied to everything, refusing to become decorative or helpless, insisting on her share of the work at a level that was reasonable, accepting Samuel's help with the things that genuinely required it, which was a negotiation she conducted with the unsentimental precision of a fair-minded lawyer. Samuel learned things that winter about the nature of loving someone who will not be managed. He learned that the best help was the help that did not announce itself. He learned that she needed to maintain her own authority over her own body and her own choices, not because she was stubborn, but because her agency was the foundation of who she was, and undermining it in the name of care was not care. He held this knowledge in both hands and applied it carefully, and she recognized the application and loved him for it in a way she would not have been capable of in any earlier version of herself. Their son was born on a February morning in 1880 when the snow was thick on the roof, and the stove was burning hard, and a midwife from Abilene named Mrs. Clara Webb was present with her sleeves rolled up and her kit open and her manner as matter-of-fact as Letitia's own. He was born screaming and healthy, and with Samuel's dark eyes and Letitia's set of jaw, and he came into the world with every appearance of knowing exactly what he thought about it. Samuel was in the kitchen, because Clara Webb had been absolutely clear about where Samuel was to be during the birth, which was not in the room, and he had accepted this with the uncomplaining practicality of a man who knows which things are negotiable and which are not. He had spent the hours making coffee and being completely unable to sit down, and when Clara Webb came to the kitchen doorway and said, "A boy," he sat down abruptly on the kitchen bench with a directness that suggested his knees had made the decision for him. He held his son for the first time standing in the doorway of the bedroom, where Letitia lay propped against the pillows with her hair loose and her face exhausted, and the most luminous expression he had ever seen on any human being. The baby was very small and very convinced of his own importance, and Samuel held him with the enormous care of someone holding something that is also somehow holding him back. "Thomas," Letitia said. He looked at her. "If you consent to it," she said, "Thomas for his father. It is what I would have named him regardless of who I married. I want him to know he came from two men who were good." Samuel looked at the baby, at Thomas, with the weight of what she had just said settling into him, not as a loss but as an inheritance. "Thomas," he said, "yes, that is exactly right." Eli appeared in the doorway behind Samuel with his eyes very wide and his arms at his sides in the consciously composed posture of a 10-year-old trying to be measured, and he looked at the baby for a long moment and then said, "He is very red." "He is very new," Letitia said. "Does he work yet?" "He will," Samuel said, "in approximately 2 to 3 years for basic functions, maybe 4 before he's useful." Eli considered this. "That seems like a long time to wait." "Agreed," said Samuel. "We will manage." Eli came forward then and looked at his brother, this very red, very new person with the seriousness that was the root of all of his expressions, and something moved across his face, quiet and deep, and he said, "Hello, Thomas," in a voice that was trying to be ordinary and was not, and that was the moment, more than any other, that Letitia felt the full scope of what had been built in this house, this woman who had closed every door and this man who had kept knocking, and this family. Unplanned and unlikely and absolutely real. The years that followed the birth of Thomas were the years in which Letitia Dawson Lockhart learned, by increments and occasionally by surprise, what it was to stop waiting for the loss. This was not a simple thing. The habit of waiting for loss is not broken by happiness alone. It persists in the specific shape of waking in the night and listening for breathing, in the tightening of the chest when Samuel was out in a storm and taking longer than expected to return, in the half-second of ancient fear that preceded the ordinary reassurances of still here, still present, still whole. She did not rid herself of these habits entirely. She simply learned to recognize them for what they were, the scar tissue of old wounds, not prophecy. Samuel understood this without her having to explain it, because he had his own version of the same, his own midnight listening, his own particular vigilance, the legacy of a father who had worked himself into the ground and a mother who had followed him into the absence. They had between them the blueprint of a good and careful life maintained by two people who had learned that nothing is permanent and who had chosen, in full knowledge of that impermanence, to build anyway. They built. The Lockhart homestead expanded. Samuel brought cattle from his Wichita operation and integrated them into the Dawson herd, and together they ran one of the better operations in the county. Not the largest, but sound and well managed, and they had a reputation at the Ellsworth market that meant fair prices and return buyers. Letitia continued to keep the books with the exacting attention she had always brought to them, and she continued to negotiate sales with the direct efficiency that had been remarked on by buyers for years. And she trained Eli in both, because Eli was coming up on the age when a young man needed to know how to conduct his own business. In the spring of 1882, the Garfield family's eldest son, a young man named Robert Garfield, began spending a great deal of time in the vicinity of the Lockhart property in a way that had nothing to do with ranching. He was 20 years old, earnest and hard-working, and he had fixed his attention on a young woman named Pearl Aldridge who lived on the neighboring property to the east, and his route between his family's spread and Pearl's consistently brought him past the Lockhart fence line, where he had developed the habit of stopping to talk to whoever was working there. Letitia watched this pattern for several weeks before she said anything. What she said finally to Samuel in the kitchen one evening was, "That boy is in love with Pearl Aldridge and he has no idea how to tell her." Samuel looked up from the land contract he was reviewing. "How do you know?" "He turns red when he passes the east fence," she said, "which faces her family's property." "Ah," Samuel said. "I'm going to invite them both to supper," Letitia said. "You are playing matchmaker," Samuel said, with the particular expression he wore when she was doing something that surprised him. "I am providing an occasion," she said, which was not quite the same thing, and they both knew it. Pearl and Robert came to supper, separately and with the mutual pretense that it was entirely coincidental, and by the end of the evening they were talking to each other with the velocity of two people who have just discovered that someone else has been thinking exactly what they have been thinking, and the pretense was wearing transparently thin, and Letitia poured the coffee and felt something she identified, after a moment, as a specific and experienced satisfaction. Samuel caught her eye across the table and she looked back at him and said nothing, and said everything. In the summer of 1882, she told him she was expecting again. "Again," said Eli, who was 13 now and had developed a dry wit that Letitia recognized as a direct inheritance from herself and which she chose not to comment on. "The mathematics of this are not difficult," Letitia said. "I know the mathematics," Eli said with 13-year-old dignity. "Then you understand the situation," said Letitia. "I understand the situation," said Eli. "I am simply noting that this is the second time the situation has occurred." "Yes," said Samuel. "So it is." Thomas, who was 2.5 and still working on the full scope of human language, pointed at Letitia's stomach and said, "Baby," in a tone of profound suspicion. "Baby," Samuel confirmed. Thomas sat with this information, nodded once, and went back to the wooden horse he had been maneuvering across the kitchen floor, apparently having resolved the philosophical dimension of the question to his satisfaction. The second child was born in January of 1883, a girl this time, delivered with the same practical efficiency as Thomas, and with considerably more volume from the moment she arrived, and she was immediately in possession of her father's stubborn quietness and her mother's habit of absolute decision. They named her Margaret, for Samuel's mother, and she was from her first weeks a person with strong opinions about everything within her purview, which was to say, everything. Eli looked at her in the same way he had looked at Thomas, with that serious elder-child assessment, and then said, "She's very loud." "She has things to say," Letitia said. "About what?" "We'll find out," Samuel said. They did find out, and they went on finding out, year by year, as Margaret grew into a girl who was afraid of nothing and interested in everything, and who followed her father through the ranch with the same purposeful attention that Eli brought to his books, and who asked questions that required real answers and knew immediately when she was being given a simplified version. Eli, meanwhile, was growing into a young man with a quality of seriousness that had deepened over the years into something that was also, underneath, warmth. He had been 17 when he rode to Abilene alone for the first time on ranch business, conducting a sale with the direct precision that Letitia had spent years teaching him. And the buyer had remarked to Samuel afterward that the Lockhart boy was as straight as a plumb line and twice as reliable. And Samuel had taken this home to Letitia, and she had absorbed it with the expression she always wore when she was feeling something larger than she was going to acknowledge, which was to say. She had looked at the middle distance for a moment and then said, "Yes, he is." In 1885, when Eli was 16, he began asking questions about his father. Real questions, not the factual ones he had always known the answers to, where Thomas Dawson had come from and how he had died, but the deeper ones, the ones about who he had been, what he had thought about, what his laugh had sounded like, what he had loved. Letitia sat with her eldest son on the porch steps one June evening, and she told him his father. She told him the whole of Thomas Dawson, not the absence she had been carrying for a decade, but the man himself, his gentleness and his humor, and the particular way he had of fixing things that was always slightly unorthodox but always worked, his love of the land, his pride in Eli, who he had spoken about in the months before his death with the specific joy of a man who cannot believe his luck. Eli listened with the expression she had been watching all his life, that serious, whole-attention expression that was also underneath love. "He would have liked Samuel," Eli said when she had finished. "He would have," she said. "They are built the same way in the important parts." Eli thought about this. "Is that why you married him? Because he reminded you of father?" She considered the question honestly, because honest questions deserved honest consideration. "No," she said. "They are similar in character but very different as people. I married Samuel because he knocked on every door I closed, and he knocked on them not to force them open but to tell me he was on the other side. And eventually I understood that having someone on the other side is not the same as losing yourself. It is the opposite thing." Eli was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "Then typically, supper." "Yes," she said, "supper," and they went in. The summer of 1886 brought a drought that settled over the Central Plains like a held breath, baking the grass brown and dropping the creek to a thread, and testing the cattle operations across the county in ways that separated the well-managed from the merely lucky. The Lockhart operation was well-managed. Letitia had been rotating the eastern pasture on a 3-year cycle that maintained the soil's water retention, a practice she had developed from the irrigation manual Samuel had brought her 8 years ago and refined through her own observation. Their cattle were in better condition than most in August when the drought was at its worst, which meant better prices at the reduced fall market and the financial stability to weather the winter without selling down the herd at a loss. Several of their neighbors were not so fortunate, and this was where the other side of Letitia Dawson Lockhart revealed itself, the one that did not feature in the public image of the straight-backed, precise woman who negotiated her own sales and read her own contracts and needed nothing from anyone. When the Aldridge family to the east had their well run dry in September, it was Samuel who rode over with 2 barrels from the Lockhart supply without being asked, and it was Letitia who followed an hour later with a written proposal for shared water access from the Lockhart Creek that she had already submitted to the county clerk for filing. When Robert and Pearl Garfield lost a third of their cattle to the summer heat, it was Letitia who sat at their kitchen table with their numbers and showed them, item by item, how to restructure the losses for tax purposes and what to prioritize in the following year's budget. She was not soft about it. She was practical and direct and exact. But she was there in the room at the table, and the being there meant more than the practical advice, which they could have gotten from any accountant. Deputy Ellis, who had by now been promoted to sheriff and had a wife and 2 children of his own, said to Samuel one afternoon at the dry goods store in Abilene, "Your wife is the best thing that happened to this county since the railroad." Samuel had smiled. "Don't tell her that. She'll point out the railroad's structural deficiencies." "She'd be right about them," Ellis said. The drought broke in October, rain coming in off the plains in the long, washing sheets that turned the creek back to its proper level and brought the grass back to life in the slow, persistent way of things that know they are necessary and do not hurry. Letitia stood on the back porch and watched it come in and felt the tension in the land release in the same way tension releases in a person when the thing they have been braced against finally resolves. Samuel came and stood beside her without speaking, and she leaned into his side in the way she could now, without measuring the cost of it, without calculating the risk, simply being next to him because being next to him was where she wanted to be. Thomas came out in his boots and his coat and stood in the yard with his face turned up to the rain, because Thomas was 6 years old and had his father's quality of undramatic presence and his mother's complete relationship with the natural world, and rain was a fact worth being in. Margaret appeared at the door in her nightgown, having apparently woken from a nap, and observed her brother in the rain and then announced, "I want to be in the rain too." "It is cold," Letitia said. "Thomas is in it. Thomas has his coat." "I will get my coat," said Margaret, with the perfectly logical tone of someone who has resolved the one remaining obstacle and cannot understand why this conversation is continuing. "Get your coat," Samuel said, and looked at Letitia, and Letitia looked at her 4-year-old daughter who was already halfway back inside for the coat, and the expression that came to her face was one that she had not had the capacity for 10 years ago, unguarded and warm and entirely present. The expression of a woman who knows the dimensions of what she has built and is no longer afraid to look at them directly. Eli, 17, came home from Abilene where he had been conducting his first independent sale on behalf of the ranch, and he came in out of the rain with his hat soaked and his face flushed with the particular satisfaction of a thing done and done well, and he put the payment receipt on the kitchen table in front of his mother, and she picked it up and reviewed it and said, without looking up, "You got $2 more per head than I expected." "The market was better than the estimate," Eli said. "No," she said, "the market was exactly as estimated. You negotiated better than the estimate." She set the paper down and looked at him. He met her gaze with the eyes he had inherited from his father, dark and straight. "Good work," she said simply. Eli had turned 16 the same summer, and would turn 18 in the winter, and would be, by the following spring, a young man ready to take on the full weight of the partnership he had been growing into all his life. Not just the ranch work, but the thinking of it, the planning of it, the long-view responsibility that was the real inheritance she had been preparing him for since the day Thomas Dawson had died and left her with 40 acres and a boy and the necessity of continuing. She thought about that in the October kitchen with the rain on the roof and all of them inside, the accounts balanced and the drought broken and the cattle sound and her family around her in the warm room. She thought about the woman she had been on the October morning 3 years after Thomas's death when she had stood on the back porch steps in the dark and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of grief and then gone back inside. She thought about the door she had kept closed. She thought about a man on a horse riding 14 miles every Tuesday to knock on it. She thought about herself, pressing a gun against that man's chest and telling him to leave, and him standing there in the late afternoon light and refusing, not because he was arrogant or because he was laying a trap or because he had a hidden motive she had not yet found, but because he had decided something about her worth knowing and had meant it. The radical, disarming simplicity of being meant. She had spent years believing that meaning was the thing you could not trust, the thing that changed, the thing that followed you into warmth and then withdrew, leaving you colder than before. She had built her walls so carefully against meaning. She had constructed her life to require nothing from anyone, and to give out resources and not feelings, and to be, above everything, impenetrable. And here she was, 40 acres that had become 70, one milk cow that had become a herd, a debt that had become solvency, a house that had become a home, a son who had become a young man, a daughter who was already inexhaustible, a second son in his boots in the rain, and a man who had turned up every Tuesday and kept turning up until she understood that the door was not a protection. It was a wall, and walls were not the same as strength. Strength was the thing you could still feel when you opened the door and let the cold in, and stood in it with someone who was going to stand there with you. She went inside and found Samuel at the stove, which he had taken over for the evening the way he occasionally took over things that needed doing, without announcement and with simple competence, and she stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment just looking at him, this man in his 40s who had the same unhurried quality he had at 34, the same quality of presence, the same steady eyes. He looked over his shoulder and found her watching him. "All right?" he asked. "More than all right," she said. She came in and closed the door behind her, not against the world, against the cold, which was a different thing entirely. That evening, after Thomas and Margaret had been put to bed, and Eli had gone to his room with his books, and the house had settled into its nighttime breathing, she and Samuel sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, and she told him what she had been thinking on the porch. She told him about the 10-minute sessions on the back steps. She told him about the years of calculating everything, and trusting nothing, and the particular exhaustion of maintaining a wall that requires constant upkeep. She told him about the morning she had pressed the gun against his chest, and what she had been trying to do with it. Not kill him. She had never intended to pull the trigger, but use the threat of him leaving to make him leave, to turn her own fear into a weapon pointed outward where she could manage it. He listened with his elbows on the table and his hands folded and his eyes on her face, giving her the full attention she had always given everything, the quality of attention that said, "I am here in this room, and nothing you say is going to make me leave." "I was trying to protect myself," she said. "I told myself I was protecting the farm, protecting Eli, protecting everything I had built, but I was protecting the particular version of myself that didn't need anything. And the version of myself that didn't need anything was also the version that couldn't feel anything fully. They are the same thing, Samuel. The armor and the numbness are the same thing." "I know," he said. "I am still afraid sometimes," she said. "I wake up at night and I listen. I still have that." "So do I," he said. "But I am not running the farm from inside a wall anymore," she said. "I am running it from here." She put her hand flat on the table between them. "From this room and this table and this whole thing we have built." He put his hand over hers on the table. The lamp between them made the room small and warm, and outside the rain had stopped and the creek was running high and the cattle were sound in the pasture and the grass was coming back, the way it always came back, because it was necessary and it knew it was necessary and it simply kept growing. "You know what I think about," he said, "on the nights I wake up. Tell me." "I think about the Tuesday you pointed that gun at me," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way she loved. "And I think she didn't pull the trigger. Even then, even in the worst of her fear, she didn't pull it." "I thought about it," she admitted. "I know you did," he said, "and you put the gun down anyway." She looked at him across the lamp and the table and the years. "You were very irritating," she said, "coming back every Tuesday, being entirely reasonable, not giving me any legitimate reason to be angry at you." "I did try to be aggravating," he said gravely. "I'm sorry I failed." She laughed, the deep laugh, the one from below ordinary happiness. "No, you're not," she said. "No," he agreed, "I am absolutely not." They sat together in the kitchen until the lamp needed trimming, which was a long time, talking and sometimes not talking, in the easy way of two people who have passed through the place where silence is uncomfortable and arrived at the place where it is simply another way of being together, as much a conversation as words, full of the history of everything said and unsaid, and resolved and built and continuing to be built, morning after morning, Tuesday after Tuesday, on a stretch of land that the wind had been trying to reclaim since the day it was first broken. The land stayed. They stayed. The spring of 1887 brought with it the kind of morning that makes Kansas forgive itself for everything, clear and enormous and smelling of new grass and creek water, and the particular freshness that follows a long winter's release. And Letitia Dawson Lockhart walked out of the house in the early light with her coffee in her hands and stood on the porch and looked at her land. 70 acres and growing, a herd of 212 head, a barn with a sound roof, glass in every window, fences that ran straight to the horizon, a kitchen garden that Eli had expanded last fall with an ambition she had encouraged because ambition in the service of something useful was one of the things she had always believed in most. From the north pasture she could hear Thomas, who was 7 now, and absolutely convinced he was already a full hand, talking to the cattle in the earnest way he had, a running commentary on his progress that the cattle appeared to find neither interesting nor alarming. From the house behind her she could hear Margaret, 5, explaining something to Samuel with the particular volume of a child who has not yet learned to differentiate between importance and urgency, which meant she used maximum volume for everything. Eli came around the corner of the barn on his horse, back from the morning check of the south fence, and he saw her on the porch and lifted his hand in the familiar gesture, and she lifted her coffee cup in response, and the communication was complete. Samuel appeared in the doorway behind her, having survived Margaret's explanation, and stood beside her on the porch with his own coffee and looked out at what they had made. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She considered it. She had always been honest in this kitchen, in this room, in this life, and she intended to go on being honest. "I am thinking," she said, "that I almost didn't open the door." He was quiet. "I am thinking that I spent 3 years building a life that worked perfectly well and was entirely right and was missing this." She gestured slightly, a small gesture that took in the land and the barn and the sound of Thomas with the cattle and Margaret in the house and Eli on the horizon and all of it, all of it. Not because it was incomplete in the way people say a woman's life is incomplete without a man. That is not what I mean. I mean that I had locked myself into the part of myself that could function, and I had thrown away the key to the part of myself that could feel, and I had told myself the functioning was enough. And it was. It kept us alive, and it kept us solvent, and it was enough. She paused. "And then you came." 14 miles every Tuesday, he said. 14 miles every Tuesday, she said. "With your unreasonable patience and your water rights documents and your bridle mending lessons and your complete refusal to be frightened of my gun." "I was slightly frightened of your gun," he said. "You were not. I was uncertain whether you would actually pull the trigger. That is a kind of fear." "And what made you decide I wouldn't?" He looked at her in the morning light. "Because you had been fighting to build something for 3 years," he said, "and pulling the trigger would have ended a fight you were winning. You were not going to end a fight you were winning." She looked back at the land. "No," she said, "I was not." The morning expanded around them, big and clear and open in the way of Kansas spring mornings, the sky going up and up to a blue that had no ceiling, the grass running all the way to the edge of the world, the cattle moving in the north pasture with their particular unhurried confidence, and Thomas narrating, and Margaret asking something in the house, and Eli's horse moving along the south fence with a steady, sound rhythm. Letitia Dawson Lockhart stood on the porch of the house that had been hers alone and was now theirs together, with her coffee and her husband and her whole, open, undefended life spread out in front of her in the morning light. The door behind her was open. She had stopped counting the cost of that.